Welcome to Question Time. Tonight we are in Bath, and this evening's panel are Maria Caulfield, the government's Minister for Patient Safety and Primary Care, and a trained nurse who returned to work on a COVID ward during the pandemic. Steve Reid is Labour's Shadow Justice Secretary. He was also a Shadow Minister under Ed Miliband and Jeremy Corbyn. Leader of the SNP at Westminster since 2017, former businessman and investment banker Ian Blackford. Zanny Minton Beddoes, Editor-in-Chief of The Economist, recently returned from Ukraine, where she interviewed President Volodymyr Zelensky. And journalist, columnist and TalkRadio Breakfast host, Julia Hartley-Brewer. Good evening, welcome to our panel, welcome to the audience here in Bath and of course to you at home as well. Thank you for having me. That is because Fiona is not very well. She will be back in the chair next week. You are really welcome, as you know, because I see you do it every single week, to join the conversation on social media. It's at BBC Question Time. Right, shall we start with our first question, which comes from Marianne Newell.
With the rise in the energy cap due tomorrow and people already living in poverty, what more should the government be doing to help those who are now having to choose between eating or heating?
Steve Reid.
Well, I mean, there's one very obvious thing that I think the government should be doing, and you know, as an MP, I'm getting so many emails and contacts from constituents who just can't make ends meet, because right now the whole country is facing a cost of living crisis that stems fundamentally from the damage the government has done to the economy. Rishi Sunak gave like a mini budget statement just a week ago, and after he sat down, the difference that's going to make to people's household incomes is going to take an extra £2,600 in total away from people. People cannot afford that at a time like this. This is the wrong time. Tomorrow the energy cap goes and the prices will shoot up for that, but the week after that the Conservatives are imposing a national income, a tax hike, a national insurance tax hike that will clobber the average family by over an extra £1,000 a year. The only major economy, incidentally, in the world that is imposing taxes timelines like this. It's the wrong tax at the wrong time. Something the government could do immediately, to answer your question, is impose a windfall tax on the energy companies that are making something like in excess of £3 billion surplus profits. That's profits in excess of what they had planned to be making. It wasn't earmarked for investment. This is money they didn't expect to be getting. A windfall tax on that could take that money and subsidise household incomes at this crucial moment for family finances, up to £600 off your bill for the most vulnerable families. That would be far more effective than the £200 loan that the Wonga Chancellor is making everybody take out and then pay back whether you want it or not. The government is choosing not to help when they could. Julia Hartley-Brewer.
I think what the Chancellor and what the Prime Minister could do immediately is certainly to offer help to people on the lowest incomes. All of us are going to be facing these price rises going up. We're all going to be horrified when our council tax, our energy bills, I mean, not just tomorrow, but in October as well, go sky high. And lots of people are going to be having to mess around with their household budgets to try and make ends meet. But there are millions of families that don't have that option. They simply do not have the money. And there was nothing that we heard in the spring statement to actually help those people at this moment in time. They haven't got savings, they haven't got the means to do it, and there needs to be help. And whether that is just a cut on the tax for people in that, in that circumstance, or whether it's extra benefits, or it's extra help, just one-off payments, something needs to be done, because people are not going to make it through that. That's going to be a crisis. Long term, though, and that's where we really should be thinking. After this immediate crisis, we have got to stop living in this country on a day-to-day, week-by-week, coping with the latest crisis. We have got to start planning for the future. And yes, that means building nuclear power stations. It means fracking for the gas under our feet. It means actually planning for the future. We need energy, crucially, more than anything else, we need energy that is affordable, that is reliable, and that is secure. Right now, we don't have any of those three things. Okay. And if we're going to be a serious first world country, and we're going to prosper, we need to have all of those three things. And every single time we see yet another delay in the so-called energy strategy that I don't believe even exists, we are going to be going and lurching from crisis to crisis to crisis.
Gentleman at the back in the yellow shirt.
I run a community trust locally in Bath here, and this Christmas we went out and fed 30 families their Christmas dinner. This is children that are suffering and not having food. More and more professional people, nurses, doctors, professional people are using food banks because they can't afford to put food on the table. We have families that are choosing when they go to food banks and they're offered food, they can't afford to cook the food that they may be getting offered, and it's just not acceptable, and it's time for change. People need help now, not in the future. They need it now, right now.
Yep. Thank you. Yes.
So I think with the sort of price rises that we're seeing and the volatility of fossil fuels across the globe, whatever domestic energy in terms of expansion of gas in the North Sea or fracking, it's going to be a drop in the ocean, whatever we manage to contribute domestically, because we cannot compete with what the big fossil fuel providers are doing for global markets. So that, in conjunction with net zero targets and the Herculean efforts of sustainability consultants like me to aid companies to decarbonise their organisations and to lower global atmospheric carbon emissions, why on earth are we still entertaining domestic fossil fuel extraction?
Quick word. Zanny Minton
Yeah, can I just quickly add my voice to Julia's to say that the one thing that this government needs to do is focus on people who are the hardest hit, the people who are choosing between eating and heating, and there was not nearly enough of that. It's expanding universal credit. It's really helping people who are in the toughest spots. But to answer your question, I think there's one really important thing to remember. I absolutely agree with you that we need to move as fast as possible to a renewables-led future. But in the best possible outcome, we are going to need fossil fuels for that transition. I'm sure you know that too. We're going to need particularly natural gas, which is a fuel that is an important transition fuel. So we need to invest in some of that too. And I think one of the mistakes that we all make is thinking the right thing to do is cut investment really, really dramatically in fossil fuels and move everything into renewables. We need to build up the renewables infrastructure as fast as we can. We're not doing enough to do that. But to have a sustainable transition, we're going to need to do more investment in fossil fuels as well, particularly natural gas, which is why, Steve, I don't actually think a windfall tax is a good idea. Because whacking these, I don't think it is, because these companies need to invest. Part of the reason we're in this problem is that we've seen a collapse in investment right now, which means one of the reasons energy prices have soared is that we haven't been investing enough in energy. So I think we need a smooth transition. We need as much as possible from the renewables. We need more investment in renewables, more renewables investment in infrastructure, batteries, all of the things that we need as part of that transition. But we are going to need gas for a while as that transition happens.
For decades.
Yes,
for decades.
There's a short-term and there's a long-term aspect to this. Short-term, people are really hurting right now. I've genuinely got constituents who cannot afford to put food on the table.
I started off by saying we should help them.
£600 would make the world a difference to them. But of course, for the longer term, we should be investing in renewables, wind, wave power, retrofitting our homes. We've got the worst energy efficiency in our housing in the whole of Europe because the government cut the retrofitting programme. So much we could do to really get our sustainability levels up.
Ian Blackford.
This is a massive crisis, and I guess most people haven't lived through the kind of inflation that we're seeing unless you were around in the 1970s, as some of us were. But, you know, you're talking about the price cap coming off tomorrow. You're talking about people on average seeing a £700 increase in their energy costs tomorrow. You're talking about if you live off-grid, which many people do in the north of Scotland, for example. They buy heating oil, and I checked the price tonight. The price has gone up from 44 pence a litre a year ago to 118. That means that people are paying almost £1,200 to fill their tank. People can't afford this. And, you know, I would appeal to Tory MPs to recognise that the Chancellor has got to change course. There is no point the Chancellor saying there is a loan coming later this year, because people need it today and they need cash in their pockets. And I would say, look, learn some of the lessons from what we've done in Scotland, because it's the poorest that are paying the brunt of this. We've increased social security spending, where we have control over spending, by 6% in Scotland. And you can contrast that to the £20 a week cut to universal credit. People are going to have to make difficult choices of heating or eating. And when you talk about food banks, we know that people are going to food banks and saying, give us cold food that we can eat. Because even if you give us food from that food bank, we don't have the necessary funds in order to cook. This is as big a social crisis that we have faced for decades.
Okay.
And the government has got to recognise, not later, not 6 months away, right now, the government has got to put cash in people's pockets.
We'll come to Maria Caulfield for the government in a moment, but let's just get some more views from the audience. Hello.
Just to build on the lady on my right's point, investing in non-renewable sources right now, do you seriously not think that in the long term that's going to plunge us into an even deeper crisis?
No, we're not in a crisis right now in terms of on that aspect of things. With all due respect, you're part of the problem, madam, because this move towards net zero in a randomly plucked date in 2050, which, by the way, was decided by Parliament after a 90-minute debate. I've spent longer choosing socks than that, for goodness sake. It is utterly ridiculous.
It's about a reduction in global atmospheric carbon emissions to reduce a global temperature rise.
And what's that going to achieve?
Pardon?
What will us hitting that in... We're not going to hit it, but if we did hit it, what would that achieve?
It will stop ecosystem collapse.
It won't.
Yes, it will.
It has less than 1%
You can be a climate change
impact.
denier, Julia, but there are scientists who
I asked you a question. This is your field. It's have less than 1% of impact. Do you think that's going to make a big difference?
Sorry, 1% of what?
Our contribution to global warming from our country is 1% of carbon emissions.
We can't opt
It's a global effort. These are global organisations that are emitters of carbon.
Hang on. Let the lady finish.
This is a global problem, and it's not about individual targets. It's about everyone working together to reduce atmospheric carbon, to reduce the rise in temperatures so that we don't see a further escalation of ecosystem collapse around the world, increases in volatility of weather patterns, flooding, forest fires, refugee crises, people moving.
Well done.
Climate change is a huge disaster.
Can I just give you an example? Because
briefly, because then I need to bring in
we just had the ScotWind round in the last few weeks, and we're greenlighting 11 gigawatts of new offshore wind capacity. We have 25% of Scotland's wind capacity off the Scottish shores. We had demand for about 25 gigawatts. We could increase over the next 25 years our green energy in Scotland about fivefold from where we currently are. We can fill that gap. And by the way, we can also provide the base load with tidal, which can reduce that need for nuclear that's been talked about. We can produce that base load. We can do it off green energy. We can make sure that we can deliver safe and cheaply the green energy that we need.
I'm going to remind you of Marianne's question, actually, which was, with the rise in the energy cap due tomorrow and people already living in poverty, what more should the government be doing to help those who are now having to choose between eating or heating? Maria Caulfield.
Yeah, so just to cover a number of the points, I mean, these are very difficult times. I'm a constituency MP. I recognise many of the struggles that families in my constituency are facing with the surge in prices, the energy price cap, which has up until now saved households around £700 a year on fuel prices. And when that goes up after tomorrow, we will still have significantly lower energy prices than many other European countries. So the energy price cap is still protecting some of those price rises. But we are making some significant help to some of the lowest income households. You know, tomorrow the national living wage goes up, which will increase about £90 a month, so over £1,000 a year for the lowest paid earners. We are altering the universal credit taper, which will again bring in around £1,000 a year for the lowest paid households. We have lifted the national insurance threshold, so that will improve the income for about 70% of households. By about £300 a year. So there are a number of policy introductions that we have made specifically targeted at the lowest income households. But can I just come back to Steve? Can I come back to Steve? Can I come back to Steve's point about this £600 windfall tax? Because I think Labour are naive. I mean, it's only £600, and the Shadow Chancellor confirmed this morning that's only for a third of households, so it's not for every household.
Everyone will get
the national insurance threshold will improve the outlook for 70% of households. But Labour are naive if they think energy companies won't then pass that tax on to their customers. And as has already been said, those energy companies, if we want to invest in our energy for the future, will need that money to invest, whether it's in renewables or whether it's in fossil fuels in the short term. So I think it's a foolish tax to introduce.
Why do you think the Chancellor didn't increase benefits?
So he has increased the universal credit taper. He did that before the spring statement, but that is already making a difference to households, and it's about £1,000 a year difference, and that's because he wants to...
But you know what inflation is now. I mean, it's over 6%. Benefits will go up by 3%. By the end of the year, inflation could be 9%, 10%.
But that is only one of the areas that we're helping. We're helping with the national insurance threshold.
Doesn't help people on benefits.
Well, it does. I mean, if some people on benefits are actually working and paying national insurance, and that is crucial to understand.
Zanny Minton Beddoes.
Yeah, I think, Maria, it's not quite right what you're saying. I think the universal credit is going up, as Victoria says, by 3%. Inflation is much, much higher than that. There was nothing done in the statement last week to expand on universal credit. So I think it's fair to say that the Chancellor is not doing very much for those who are choosing between eating and heating. Yeah. And if you look at the overall impact, I think the forecast by the OBR is that before the Chancellor's stuff last week, average per person income was going to go down by 3%, which is historically the highest on record. What the Chancellor is doing is bringing that down to 2.2%. So a little bit of it has been helped, but really not that much. And that's been weighted disproportionately to higher income people. So I think the bottom line is the Chancellor is not doing as much as he could do, and he's not doing very much for those at the bottom. And that's just the facts.
OK. Before we move on to our next question, let me tell you that Fiona will be back in the chair next week, and the programme is coming from Canterbury. The Archbishop of Canterbury will be a guest on the programme, and then after Easter, the programme is in Romford. If you want to be in the audience, then you are very welcome. All you have to do is go to the Question Time website and follow the link and crack on and fill in the form. Right, let's move to our next question. And it comes from Jonathan Koshover. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi. Good evening. Is there any cause for hope in light of the reported shift of Russia's military focus within Ukraine, or do we think this is just further shadow games from the Kremlin?
I'm going to go to Zanny, because you've just come back from Ukraine, where you interviewed President Zelensky.
I have, and thank you. I think that there is some cause for hope, but I would take what the Russians are saying very, very sceptically. Certainly in Kiev, they're taking that very, very sceptically. The Russians are saying we're now making a strategic decision to focus on the east of Ukraine. There's still shelling going on in Kiev. There's still shelling going on in Chernihiv. So no one really takes the Russians at their word. That said, they have clearly, more than a month into this, failed in what they thought they would do and what most people thought they would do, which was be able to roll into Kiev within 72 hours. They have failed. I was there. There are shells on the outside of Kiev, but the city centre is well fortified. And what's more important, the people there, led by Volodymyr Zelensky, are absolutely determined to resist this invasion. And they sense that they are able, not only they've been able to resist it, that in some areas the tide is turning somewhat. And people are now talking about Ukrainian victory. Now, we can debate what Ukrainian victory means, but it means that Ukraine has agency. And what's just stunning when you're there is the kind of how this entire country has come together, led by the president, but it's all of the people in the country determined, absolutely determined to face this invasion. And they are, they really are doing our work for us in the sense that that invasion, Putin's aggression, they are standing up to it in a way that I don't think any of us thought they would be able to, because it's, this huge Russian army. And so I'm feeling more optimistic, but I think that they need more sanctions on Russia and they need more weapons. And that's what President Zelensky says every single day, and he's right. They need more weapons to be able to do this.
OK, lady in the scarf, hi.
Hi. What's the thoughts in Kiev about now Putin sort of been backed into a corner a bit about the possibility of him going nuclear?
So I think in Kiev, I asked President Zelensky about that, and certainly the concern amongst NATO members about the risk of escalation, and because that's an argument that President Macron, for example, has said that you can't give offensive weapons because it risks escalation. And he said to me, they're afraid of Putin. That's it. He was very clear that it was fear of Putin. and that, you know, they felt that they are pawns in this. They feel that they can take the Russians on. They have withstood it for more than a month. And, you know, they want to have agency, they have agency, and they think that with the weapons, they can really turn this around. And it seems to me that all these debates about, you know, only supplying defensive weapons, not offensive weapons, at some level, this is somewhat semantic. They need conventional weapons to be able to, you know, take on and make progress against Vladimir Putin. Okay. And I think that when you're there, you are so clear how this country has come together to do that. It's just inconceivable to me that we wouldn't want to do that and support them.
Maria Caulfield.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the Foreign Secretary's been clear that, you know, Putin may say one thing, but his actions obviously depict a whole different level of action. And we've seen that with humanitarian corridors, where he's promised a ceasefire, promised to open them up, and literally then starts firing at people as they're fleeing. So, you know, we can't necessarily take Putin at his word, and it's around actions that he needs to be judged. And we've been very clear there won't be any lifting of sanctions until you know, there is a complete withdrawal, and we've been very united on that across NATO. But in terms of what's been said about supporting Ukraine, absolutely, and we're supplying them with 6,000 more missiles. We've been working with Ukraine long before the invasion in terms of training their troops and supporting them in case an invasion ever did come. So we absolutely will be standing with Ukraine, and you know, we'll see what happens. But yeah, actions speak louder than words.
Ian Blackford, do you have any cause for hope?
I wish I did, but we've got to look at the reality that the Russian bombing, Putin's bombing, is going on. And let's not forget out of this that this is an act of aggression against the Ukrainian people by Putin and his regime. And at the end of this, he and his regime must face the international court. They must be held accountable for the war crimes that are taking place. Who would have thought that after the end of the Second World War that we're facing war in Europe, that the scenes that we're seeing nightly on our television screens are completely unacceptable? And there is a cross-party consensus, and I'm glad there is, that we must do everything that we can to support Ukraine. We must make sure that we get defensive weapons into them. We must make sure that we're providing humanitarian help. And my goodness, we should be saluting Zelensky for the leadership he has given and the solidarity that he has had from his people, standing up against the Russians. And it's been the effect of that defence that has pushed Russia back to some extent. But let me also say that in that desire to achieve consensus, and I was delighted that working with the UK government last week, and I've commended the government in helping to get 50-odd orphans out of Dnipro into Scotland, that we must do more. We must make sure that we open our doors, we open our hearts, and those that need our sanctuary. 10 million people have been displaced in Ukraine. 4.5 million people have left that country. We need to do our bit to make sure that people can find sanctuary here today. Yeah.
We'll hear from the lady in the blue and the gentleman next to her.
We've got a minister saying that we're going to help Ukraine as much as possible, and yet we still are seeing really low numbers of, you know, refugees being allowed into this country. Last week there was a lot of talk about, yes, we're speeding up the process, we're doing everything we can to help them, and yet we're still seeing disastrous numbers of people actually being allowed, when there's been a huge outpouring of goodwill to rehome these people and support them at their time of need.
I've got the figures here, actually. 22,800 visas have been issued via the family scheme, out of 31,000 submitted. And 2,700 visas have been granted through the Homes for Ukraine scheme, out of 28,000 applications. I mean, there's a huge gap.
Yeah. But who would apply when they know how difficult it is?
Sorry, what do you mean, madam?
Well, you know, we were hearing about, you know, 20-page documents to even apply for sanctuary or to, you know, be rehomed here. The bureaucracy is absolute madness.
I mean, the reality is thousands are applying. They're just...
But how many aren't applying that would apply if they knew that it was easier to get here?
The gentleman next to you?
A simple question, really, after the press release that came out today. And it's a simple yes or no. Has NATO been defeated?
Has NATO what, sorry?
Has NATO been defeated? It's done. There was the press release that came out today that said NATO has been defeated. It's not done anything. It's not done enough.
Do you think it has?
No.
OK.
No.
I'm going to whiz round to get some more audience members' thoughts. Gentleman in the check shirt?
There are many countries which are being rather quiet on this and not taking sides. Should we not be putting pressure on them to, help us close the gap on Putin?
Like who? Which countries?
Well, India,
right,
for example.
Yeah. And the gentleman in the blue, the navy top, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to see my government put more pressure on the UK businesses like Marks and Spencers that still have franchises out in Russia, KFC, places like that. You need to put more pressure on them to stop them and close them down over in Russia because they're still funding this war.
I mean, the franchise agreements, they say, prevent them closing down those outlets in Russia. Let me come to Steve Reid. Yeah,
I mean, the journalist Raphael Baer described this situation as feeling like the past invading the present. And it does, what's going on in Ukraine feels like something from the middle of the last century, not today. And it's fantastic that there's cross-party consensus that we must do what we can to help. But the government shelved a couple of years ago the Russia report, put together by the House of Commons' own Intelligence and Security Committee, that told us that our politics, our business, our finance was far too open to dirty money linked to the Kremlin with not enough questions being asked. If we had acted then to cut that off, it would have stemmed the flow of money that pays for Putin's war machine, and that is action we should be taking now.
You're not suggesting it would have stopped President Putin invading Ukraine?
It would have stopped a lot of the money that he's using to arm his troops in those circumstances.
Is that right, Zanny? Is that right?
Can I just comment on the...
Well, let Zanny answer.
Actually, can I just go back to one other thing you said, because it's quite important, the sense that, we have a 20th century war in the 21st century. It's something that was so stunning. I went to Kiev overland, so I flew to Warsaw, took a car to the border, and then went to Lviv and took the overnight train. And when you cross that border and you get to Lviv station, you feel as though you've walked into a kind of World War II movie. It was dimmed, it was full of people, it had that acrid smell, the smell of people who haven't been able to wash, lots and lots of people living in that station. And now that I'm back here, I was there last weekend, I'm now back here, and it already feels like it had been in a movie, and it was real. And it just one thing on the refugees, when you see, and I came back through the same way, came back from the Ukrainian side into the Polish side, lots and lots, hundreds of people waiting to go through. And the woman behind me, she came from Mariupol. She left, her apartment had been bombed. She came from Mariupol. The idea that this woman is able to get together all the amount of paperwork that you need to get to a visa to the UK was completely ludicrous. She just couldn't.
Julia Hartley-Brewer.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the question in terms of the shift of Russia's focus, I mean, can we trust a single word that the Russian generals or Vladimir Putin says? No. Can Vladimir Putin, it turns out today, trust a single word that his generals say? And the fascinating thing we've learnt here is just, the abject failure of their supplies, their planning, their logistics, the morale among the conscripted Russian troops as well. However, I think the key thing we need to remember about what's happened here is that this was always going to happen. Vladimir Putin said he didn't recognise that Ukraine was a sovereign territory. He invaded in 2014. Did the West not notice? Did we just not notice that? And we barely acted. A few little sanctions here, a few sanctions there. All this time, he knew, pretty sure he thought he knew, he could go in and he could take more of the country. Now, he may well be proved wrong. I think we all certainly hope that the Ukrainians will be victorious, and largely, actually, thanks to help, training and military hardware from this country. I think we should stop undermining what we have done. As the Ukrainian MP said to me this week, it's all very well sending us blankets, but we can't fight Vladimir Putin with blankets. We need anti-tank missiles, which is what the British are sending. But the key thing I think we should remember from this is this war was always going to happen. Vladimir Putin told us he was going to do it. He amassed the troops. And in the West, we did nothing. Zilch, nothing in terms of to actually deter him from doing that. If we had acted sooner, if NATO troops had gone to the border, if we had said, you can come in and you could be an associate member of NATO, one steel toe cap of a Russian soldier into Ukrainian territory, and we will act. We could have done that. And I tell you who's watching all this time, Xi Jinping of China. And if we don't act and we don't make sure the Ukrainians are victorious, we will look back on these as our halcyon days.
OK, Let's bounce around the audience and get some more views before we move on to the next question. Gentleman in the suit and tie.
Just to build on the previous audience member's point again, how hypocritical is it for the Chancellor to say to British companies to uninvest their money out of Russia, but for him and his marriage to still have money invested in a company still operating in Russia? Is that remotely acceptable if he's telling his people to uninvest?
He says he has no relationship to any company that invests in Russia. Let's move behind. Hi.
The Ukrainians are negotiating now to be a neutral country and are making a commitment not to join NATO. And I just wonder, going back to that point about the 20th century, if that stance had been taken before the war, whether we would even be in a war now.
They were neutral in 2014.
Yes, that's true.
They were neutral in 2014 and he invaded then.
But also what they are negotiating, what they want, is to have a security guarantee as part of their neutrality. Now, a security guarantee, if it's a real security guarantee, means that they're effectively alongside NATO. So I think we need to start moving away from thinking that they are somehow not getting something they want by not being part of NATO. They will want to have some kind of security guarantee.
Yeah. At the back, yes, gentleman on the back row and the one in front of him. Hello. Hi, sir.
I just think that it's OK giving the Ukrainians defensive weapons, but I think more should be done to let the Russian people know what's been done in their name, because they're obviously not being given the true facts. And I think with the social media, somehow we can let them know what's being done in their name.
I mean, it's not for the want of trying,
they
but
might
they've
stop
banned
him.
Facebook,
The
they've
mothers
banned...
of the Russian soldiers who are dying, they might stop him.
Yeah, it's very hard, though, because basically Vladimir Putin has shut down a lot of social media and he has complete control over domestic media.
The gentleman in front,
surely we can do something about that. I don't know how.
Tomorrow, 130,000 more 18-year-old men in Russia are going to be conscripted tomorrow. And there's been a massive campaign across Eastern European countries and Germany in particular to try and contact people in Russia and say to mothers, do not send your son to the recruitment.
OK.
Exactly.
Final thought from the gentleman on this subject.
I just think the concern should also extend to Scandinavia, Sweden and Finland, which aren't in NATO. And there's been a lot of discussion there whether or not they should join. I read today that apparently one of the planes that went in Swedish airspace, but I think it was a week ago, was actually carrying a nuclear bomb. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's what's being reported in Sweden. I mean, that just sends chills down my spine.
Yeah,
and I think,
it was more recently than that, but yes.
Yeah, I think that we should have a lot of concern about the potential for, well, a nuclear war, nuclear escalation, and...
OK.
Yeah.
OK, thank you. Let's move on to our next question, and it is from Caroline Quinn.
In light of the fixed penalty notices issued this week, has Boris Johnson misled Parliament and should he resign?
Maria Caulfield.
Well, I think misleading Parliament, you have to, to be found guilty of that has to be a deliberate misleading, not inadvertently misleading. And I think Boris Johnson has been very clear there were wrongdoings around the Partygate situation. He's apologised for that. He's made changes already to number 10. And can I just say, as someone who did work on the COVID wards during the pandemic, so if no one is more angry about events that took place in number 10 because, you know, while many of us were working on the wards, we weren't having social gatherings after work. So, you know, I fully understand the anger, the frustration at what happened.
OK.
But
there was a lady here who was... we'll just wait for the microphone to come to you, if we may.
No, I just said, you know, he's holding hands up now, but because he was found out, you know, if he hadn't been called out on it...
Fair?
So, no, I mean, you know, he has held his hands up to say there were wrongdoings and he's apologised for that. He's made changes in...
But that's because the lady's suggesting because he was found out.
But, you know, I mean, he genuinely did not believe that there was wrongdoing that's happened. So, you know, and what we've said is that we will wait for the Sue Gray report. We don't know the identities of the people who've got fixed penalty notice. He isn't one of those people that's had a fixed penalty notice this week. So
when people laugh, when you say he said he didn't believe he was at a party, I mean, what does that make you think?
Look, I mean, he has, you know,
No, I'm asking you about their response.
I mean, as I've said, I fully understand the anger and the frustration.
That was laughter, that was ridicule. They don't believe him.
I understand that, and you know, people made such big sacrifices during that time, and people are angry that if the rules were broken, when they didn't see loved ones, when they had stuck by the rules themselves. So I absolutely understand the frustration and anger. And the PM has said that if he gets a fixed penalty notice, he will make that public. But he hasn't received one yet. We don't know the identity of those people that have. But he has introduced changes at number 10 as a result of that. People have lost their jobs as a result of what happened.
OK, lady here.
Boris seems to always apologise and always say, I'm sorry, but is never held accountable. But if we were to do the same, we would have been fined, we would have probably got a prison sentence. It's just ridiculous now. He's been doing this time and time again, and we're tired of it.
I don't think we'd have got a prison sentence necessarily, and he may still get a fine. Steve Reid.
It's really sad to see Tory MPs like Maria wheeled out to defend the indefensible on this. 2 months of police time wasted on this, 12 spent on this, 12 parties investigated, 20 fines issued to people working at the heart of government in number 10 Downing Street, and the rot begins at the top. Do you remember when that video came out about the press team at number 10 laughing about a party during lockdown? The next day, the Prime Minister came to the House of Commons and said he shared the outrage of the British people about that. Shortly after, we found he'd been at the party. He has lied through his teeth to the British people again and again and again. He has showed contempt for the sacrifice of the British people. People missed the funerals of their loved ones because they were following the rules that the Prime Minister believed the laws are for the little people. He's above them. He showed contempt to the British people. He lied to the British people. He lied to Parliament. He should resign. If he had anything to say, he would resign.
I understand the leader of the Labour Party is also investigated for a party.
Having a drink at lunch is not breaking the lockdown rules.
There was no investigation.
Breaking the rules.
There was no investigation.
There was photos of him having drinks with activists.
He was sat down at a table having lunch at work. That is not a party.
Exactly.
He wasn't making the rules.
No, but I'm just saying it's a bit rich from the Labour Party.
It was nothing of the sort. There was no comparison. The Prime Minister denied being at parties he was at.
He wasn't at parties.
He lied, and he lied again.
No, I think that's absolutely wrong to say. If the police find that he was at parties and...
He told us, Maria, and you, that he hadn't been to any, and he's now admitted he was at multiple parties.
See, no,
that is a lie. On his own terms.
He's not said he was at multiple parties at all. No, he
didn't need to say. We know that there's proof that he was at those parties. Going back to the question, did he mislead Parliament? Yes. And as a result of that, should he resign? Yes. I don't think there's anyone who knows me would know I'm not someone who starts from an anti-Boris stance for very different reasons. The key thing here is, and again, there was a whole, there weren't any parties, or then they were, but they weren't parties, but I wasn't at them. It turns out I was. He's been treating us as fools, and he thinks that just saying sorry is good enough. I'm afraid we're not as gullible as his various wives and mistresses over the years. The idea, harsh but I think fair, he thinks he can get away with these things. We keep being told, I've had so many Tory MPs on my radio show who tell me that the heat has gone out of this. I think the audience tonight tells us the heat hasn't gone out of it, and it certainly hasn't for me. And I'm sorry, this is not just about people missing funerals or missing being with their loved ones. It's much more than that. It's about fundamentally taking away our civil liberties, and we were told it was because it was saving lives. Now, key thing here, when people answered an email saying, yeah, I'd love to come to a bring your own booze party, and I'll bring the sausage rolls in Downing Street, those people, those dozens and dozens of people, and they went to parties every week, by the way, when we were all locked in our homes and able to see our family members, they weren't going to those parties going, gosh, I hope I survive. I'll probably die, but I'll go anyway. They knew it was perfectly safe. They knew it was fine. They were young, they were healthy, they were not worried. And yet they imposed those laws on everyone else. And when you have a government and when you have people working in number 10 who think that there are us little people who have to obey rules, but they're clever enough to know when they're safe, that is when you have an arrogant government and an arrogant number 10, an arrogant Prime Minister who think they're above us. And I don't think we should ever be ruled by people who think they're better than us and know better than us. And I'm afraid he has to go, because we should have principles in our government that if you lie to Parliament, if you make laws that you then break, you have no business being in charge of this country.
Let me remind you of Caroline's question. In light of the fixed penalty notices issued this week, has Boris Johnson misled Parliament, and should he resign?
So I agree with Julia. I think if he does get a penalty notice, it will show what we knew all along, which was that he was lying to Parliament. I think it's incredibly corrosive if you allow people to get away with that. I think if we live in a country where it's acceptable to lie to Parliament, then the kind of very fundamentals of our democracy are shaken. It's nothing new about Boris Johnson. He's had an incredibly elastic relationship with the truth for his entire life, so it shouldn't surprise us. But he won't resign because he's just not the kind of person who will resign in for that. He will brazen it out, and what is very clear now is that he won't be forced to resign because
Tory MPs
have
Tory MPs will decide.
But
they will decide, but it looks increasingly unclear that they will push him out. And there are, that we can debate whether, given what's happening in Ukraine and so forth, there'll be all kinds of discussions. But I think there is a long-term cost to allowing this kind of behaviour to be got away with. And that long-term cost comes to trust in our government, trust in our democracy, standards in public life. I think all of that stuff really matters.
So he should resign now?
Well, no, we haven't had the fixed penalty notice yet, but I do think...
But you've said he's lied and misled Parliament.
We argued that he was fundamentally unsuitable to be Prime Minister long before this.
But should he resign now?
Right this very minute?
Yes.
Yeah, why not? I'm not sure about this. Let's get the fixed penalty notice. But we do know he's lied. But he should have resigned a long time ago.
No,
right, but you're hesitant.
He ignored them.
You're hesitant to say he should resign now.
We've got into this process. So, now you're waiting for.
He's
what's
playing
the difference?
for time. He's playing for time. He hopes everyone will forget and he'll
In
get
an
away with
ideal
it.
world, he
but
would
you
have
cannot
resigned.
have a prime minister that
But he's
sets
not
rules for everyone else to follow and breaks them himself.
Okay.
Fundamentally
I agree with that.
undermines
I agree with that.
The Ministerial Code says ministers who knowingly mislead Parliament will be expected to offer.
He knew
their
he was at the
resignations.
parties.
Right, let's whiz round the audience. Hello, sir. Not the gentleman with the tie, the one behind. Hello. Yes, that's you.
The country's moved on from this old story. People aren't interested in someone having a few drinks and a piece of cake 2 years ago.
Sounds like they
and
are,
the Labour Party getting itself into a lather they can't even decide what a woman is.
So the gentleman here is suggesting most people have moved on. Is that fair? No. OK, lady in the green dress.
What kind of example are we setting our children and our young people who have been at home, like everybody else here, for the last 2 years, missed 9 months of their education where their parents were sticking to the rules, when they can see the headlines in the press and on the news and news round that at the very heart of our government, people were breaking the rules and not prepared to own up to that?
Gentleman at the front in the tracksuit jacket top thing. Hello.
Well, the assertion that the Prime Minister was lied to by his advisers and that he just repeated those lies to Parliament is just insane. I mean, that's not the sign of a good leader, and how can we have any trust in anything that he says if he's just happy to repeat the lies that have been sent to him by his advisers?
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Victoria. This actually is really simple. The Prime Minister came to Parliament in December. He told us that parties didn't take place. He told us that he wasn't at parties. Now, the fundamentals of this are that if you woefully mislead Parliament, there's no ifs, no buts, you resign. The Prime Minister has broken the ministerial code and he should have gone. And, I got myself into a bit of bother in Parliament a few weeks ago. And I was asked to withdraw the statement that the Prime Minister was a liar. And of course, I couldn't. I didn't do that. But that week, I got 14,000 emails from people right across these islands. Actually, the majority of them were Conservative voters. And they knew, we know, that Boris Johnson has lost the moral authority to lead.
OK.
And when you consider that people couldn't be with their loved ones, couldn't be in hospital, couldn't be in care homes, couldn't grieve, couldn't go to funerals, and you had the Prime Minister that was responsible for these rules, was presiding over a partying culture. That is why people are angry, and that is why that anger won't go away. But let me say to you, if I may, very briefly, it's not just about this behaviour. It's about the entitlement of being in office and a way to behave. Now, this might sound like a small thing, but the Prime Minister was at a NATO summit last week. It is the perceived wisdom that when a Prime Minister comes back from such a conference, they come to Parliament and make a statement. He didn't do so. He repeatedly didn't come to Parliament and make COVID statements. He engaged in press conferences. We've seen a long list of Tory donors end up in the House of Lords. We had the scandal of the cash for curtains that takes place. This man is undermining our democracy.
Okay.
He's a threat to our democracy. He must go.
OK, we are going to pause on that subject and we are going to move on to our next question, and it is from Lucy Begbie. Hi, Lucy.
Hi, good evening. So in light of the Ockenden report, how can you reassure pregnant women and their families that all maternity services in the UK are, in fact, safe?
Julia.
You can't. That's what we learned from that report. It's not the first report into a scandal at an NHS trust. It won't be the last. There was, of course, one we're in Bath tonight. There was, of course, one in Bristol in the 1990s involving babies at the Bristol Royal Infirmary who were dying as a result of heart surgery when they shouldn't have died. 201 babies died. 9 mums died. 94 babies were brain damaged or suffered other life-changing injuries as a result of an ideological policy of not giving women the vital medical treatment of a caesarean section to save mother and baby. It was a deliberate ideological urge. This mattered more than saving lives. Now, the thing I find extraordinary about this is that people did speak out. In every single scandal we've had at a hospital trust, Staffordshire, Bristol, everywhere, and these happen every couple of years, we learn about them. They've always gone back for years and years and years, and we have the same pattern again and again. Something goes horribly wrong, lots of people are involved, lots of people don't want to speak out, someone speaks out, their career is over, the people, the family members, in this case the parents, are demonised, even blamed for the deaths of their babies. And no action is taken until it gets into the media, until we finally learn there's a full investigation. Then we discover what's actually really gone on. This happens again and again and again. And we need to have a complete change of culture where people own up to mistakes, they admit them, and that the culture is one where we learn and we go with best practice and we don't cover up. Because if you are working in a hospital, if you're working in the NHS and you don't care if more babies or more mums are dying because of your policies and you don't try and change that, you've got no business being in a hospital ward or maternity ward. Frankly, you should probably be in jail. But this obsession with natural birth has got to stop. Giving birth is a really dangerous thing. And one of the reasons why we medicalised it was because it made it safer. And we need to stop having ideology ruling whether or not a mum and a baby go home after giving birth.
Yeah.
Steve Reed.
Well, I mean, it's so extraordinarily shocking to think that I think it was nearly 300 babies either died or suffered severe brain damage in maternity units in a part of the National Health Service where all of us entrust our safety and the safety of our families when we're not in. And it's remarkable how some of those parents, despite the grief, the extraordinary, unimaginable grief that they suffered, turned that into a campaign to stop this from happening, to expose what went wrong. And I want to pay tribute to those parents. But as so often when you get failure in an organisation, and Donna Ockenden in her report points to this, there was a real failure of leadership at the top and a failure to set a culture that was open, that could learn, that could understand criticism and change things. And this went on for nearly 2 decades. You know, that's how long it went on. So you have to have new models of openness, accountability, putting patients at the heart of decision-making for once in this bureaucracy, as in every bureaucracy or organisation. And, you know, the changes that Donna Ockenden recommends are not optional. They must now happen to restore women's and parents' faith in the maternity services.
Ian Blackford.
I mean, it's just shocking when you hear the trauma that all these women, the families that have gone through. And I mean, these kind of things should not be happening in a modern, civilised society, that we absolutely must learn from this. These are failures of governance. And we need to ask questions as to what was happening with the leadership in the trust. We need to ask what was happening in terms of the regulator as well. And there is no point in us having these reports and this carrying on elsewhere. Absolutely, lessons must be learned. Life must be something that we make sure has every chance of being able to be delivered, and to see what these women, what these families have gone through. This can never, ever, ever happen again. Let's make sure that we invest correctly in nursing and midwifery. Let's make sure that we've got the systems that flag up where people are not getting the care and attention that they need. Women need support through pregnancy. They need support post-pregnancy as well. By goodness, this must lead to a step change in the support women need, and that they can enjoy the childhood that they should expect to see from their young children that they're giving birth to, without the fear of this massive loss of life that we've seen in this particular case.
Yesterday, Scotland's Health Secretary reversed the downgrading of a maternity unit in Moray to stop mothers having to travel 65 miles to Aberdeen to give birth.
It's a situation I know about because it's not far from my own area of delivering maternity health care in Moray at Dr Gray's Hospital. But I think in a way, though, it strikes at the heart of the things that we're talking about, because what's been done at Dr Gray's is it's going to be consultant-led, and we need to make sure that we've got the professional support, guidance and leadership that mothers need, and you're balancing that off and the types of distances that people have to travel. I live in the Isle of Skye. Mothers have to go to Raigmore because it's the right thing to do. Why? Because we don't want the kind of outcomes that we're talking about tonight.
And the majority of pregnant women in Caithness are now transferred 100 miles to Inverness.
Well, there is a review that's taking place on that at the moment.
So
and
that
it's
could be
absolutely
changed as well.
It's crystal clear that we need to do the best for mothers. But if I may say, over the course of the last few years, we have invested heavily in midwifery staff. In fact, since we came into government, it's up about 14.5%. And we've introduced the Best Start programme, which has been very beneficial for expectant mothers. But look, yes, of course, but we will have to learn from this report as well. Yeah. We will need to make sure that we're looking at best practice, because at the end of the day, we've got to do the best we can for mothers as they go into the pregnancy system before they go through hospital.
Lady on the front row, hello.
As a mother with five healthy children, you reel off these figures. They're horrendous, awful. And my first child was delivered by my sister, who is a midwife, and she comes home and she tells me what's going on. You would not believe the stories she brings home about shortages of staff, etc., and restrictions on the number of caesareans hospitals are allowed to have. I've heard of people in this day and age, 28 hours in labour, and they won't do a caesarean.
Oh, I did 74.
OK, I mean, the Royal College of Midwives have dropped that target now for natural births. Maria Caulfield.
Yeah, so I'm the minister that's responsible for maternity, and I've met with Donna both before the publication and on the eve of the publication as well. And so the stories are absolutely harrowing, and I think the Secretary of State, in the chamber has said that the only normal birth is a safe birth. We have to move away from this target, and the Royal College has dropped that target. And it was key in Telford and Shrewsbury that they used to pride themselves on the low number of caesarean sections. And Donna herself says that if women were listened to, and that's a key factor, women were saying there was a problem either during their pregnancy, at the time of their birth, and after their pregnancy, and they were just dismissed. If they were listened to, many of those babies could have been saved. But there's a perfect storm of failures. There wasn't just one or two issues. The culture of bullying of staff who also tried to speak out and weren't listened to. There was also the management themselves. There was the turnover. When local MPs like Lucy Allen and Philip Dunn raised this with the management of the trust, they used to dismiss it as these were problems that were happening in the past, and they were happening right there and then, and dismiss them out of hand. And even the CQC, who are the independent regulator, went into that trust and didn't spot the problem. So there's fundamental problems across the board. So as the minister, I take it very personally that we urgently need to improve things. On the point of just generally, is it safe in this country? There's 600,000 births a year. The majority of those are safe and happy births. And we are improving. Our outcomes aren't as good as I want them to be, but we are improving. We've reduced stillbirth rates by 25%, neonatal deaths by 36%, maternal deaths as well. There's a huge amount more to do, and the Secretary of State is accepting every single one of Donna's recommendations, both nationally, locally, and for him personally.
And does that include the funding? Because number one on Donna Ockenden's list of essential and immediate actions is funding financing a safe maternity workforce, and that means £200 to £350 million each year.
So we already had 95,000 after her interim report.
95 million.
95 million.
Yep.
And this week we've announced another 127 million to get us over that 200 million mark. One of my absolute priorities is maternity care in my brief. And I can say to women, I can say to midwives up and down that country that we will take this extremely seriously. Okay. It won't be another report that just sits on a shelf.
Quick word from the lady in red.
Hi. I'm a mum of three as well, and I've been a mum for over the last 12 years, and I have watched the system go down. Every time I have a child, I think, gosh, this is worse. And I also hear lots of people who are midwives, and they just don't have any of the numbers of staff that when I started out being pregnant 12 years ago. It was a very, very different system. And even if you start now, it's going to take many, many years to train up the numbers of people that you need.
2,000 midwives were short, according to the Royal College of Midwives and Health Education England.
We're still at risk. Mums are still at risk until you get back up to those numbers.
OK, Zanny.
So I'm really shocked by this. I come from Shropshire, so my family's local hospital is the Shrewsbury and Telford Trust. And I had my kids in America, so I was, I guess, luckily not anywhere near it. But watching and reading about it now, I'm struck not just about how awful these numbers are, but the fact that it went on for 2 decades. Yeah. And it went on with mums basically being silenced, no one believing them. And this culture of cover-up, this culture of we have to hit these natural birth targets come what may. And what it makes me worry about is this, I'm sure it's isolated in the sense that it's the absolute worst example, but I find it hard to believe that there aren't other examples of similar risky things happening in the NHS when you have a culture of targets, when you have a culture of covering things up, you have a kind of bureaucracy that is defensive, that is worried about kind of admitting mistakes. And so I absolutely agree with all of the recommendations, and it will need more funding for maternity care. But more broadly, there has to be a kind of thinking in the NHS about how can you actually have a culture where mistakes are admitted, where patients are taken seriously, where mothers are taken seriously in maternity cases. And that, for me, was the really shocking thing. This could go on for 2 decades.
Yeah. OK. Thank you very much to all of you. Ladies and gentlemen, that is it. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to you, the audience. Thank you for watching at home. And, yeah, that's it from Question Time. Good night.